I thought I was just making one last delivery before clocking out, a routine stop on a rainy Thursday evening. Just a box of prescriptions, a polite exchange, maybe a smile or two. I didn't know that behind that door was a woman with eyes that carried years of silence, a house heavy with untold stories, and a heart quietly waiting for someone to notice it was still beating. I never expected that a simple favor would lead me into a space so raw, so human, that it would change the way I understood healing and, not just hers, but my own. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It started like most of my evenings do. I work part-time for a small-town pharmacy in Waverly Falls. A quiet stretch of winding roads and aging oak trees tucked between the hills of northern Vermont. The pharmacy is run by the Callahans, a kind older couple who've been in the community for decades. And during the colder months, when their other driver heads south to avoid the snow, I step in to help with deliveries. Nothing fancy, just medicine, vitamins, the occasional heating pad or snack bundle for someone who can't make it out in the ice. I've always found a strange peace in the solitude of it all, driving with soft static on the radio and winter light casting shadows across empty porches. But that evening, as I turned down the last road on my list, something in my gut shifted. Her name on the slip read, Lenora Blake. Address was on Hawthorne Lane, a road I barely ever had cause to visit. I'd heard the name before, in fragments of conversation mostly from the elderly who'd stop in the pharmacy to chat while picking up their meds. Rumors? Really? That she lived alone? That she'd once been vibrant and involved, the kind of woman who led local charity drives and made too much soup for one. But then something happened, and she vanished into her house like a ghost that no one was brave enough to bother. The driveway was gravel, wet, and uneven. Her porch light flickered weakly against the growing dusk. I grabbed the small brown bag from the passenger seat, double-checked the label, and jogged through the mist toward the door. I wasn't expecting anything strange, just a hand through the crack in the door, a thank you, maybe a tip if I was lucky. But what I got was different. She opened the door fully. Not a crack, not a sliver. Wide open, like she wanted the night air to spill inside. She stood there in a faded green sweater, her silver hair pulled back into a low bun, and eyes that looked at me like she was searching for a memory. I remember blinking, caught off guard. Her presence was ... still. Not cold, not warm, just still, like a photograph come to life. She said thank you, quietly, and reached for the bag. I could have handed it over and walked back to my car. But something about the way she took it, like it weighed more than it should, it made me pause. She turned slowly, walking back inside without closing the door behind her. The hallway light was on. It illuminated family portraits on the wall, a pair of worn slippers by a bench, a slight limp in her left step that she tried to hide. I stood there in the doorway for a second longer than I should have, then called out gently, "Ma'am." "Did you want me to?" But before I could finish, she turned back and said, almost too softly, "Would you mind staying just a moment? It's been a quiet day." And that was it. No theatrics, no dramatic tone, just a quiet request in the space between loneliness and routine. I stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of eucalyptus and thyme, not stale, just ... lived in. Gestured to a chair in the living room and sat opposite me, her hands resting gently on the armrest like she was used to being alone in that position. We didn't speak for a moment. The sound of the wall clock ticked steadily between us. I glanced around framed photographs of younger days, a knitting basket near the fireplace, a calendar still open to last month. "You don't have to talk." "If you're tired," she said suddenly, almost as if reading my thoughts, "it's just nice to hear the floorboards creak again with someone else's steps." I smiled awkwardly, unsure what to say. I was used to making drop-offs, not having sit-downs. But something in her tone disarmed me. It wasn't sadness. It was absence. Quiet, yawning absence of company, conversation, presence. The kind that doesn't show in wrinkles, but in the way someone doesn't flinch at silence anymore. "I'm Jonah," I offered eventually. Just helping out the Callahans for a few months, she nodded. I know, I've seen you from the window last week. You helped Mrs. Donner across the street when her mail blew into the snow. I blinked. Da-da-da-da-da. I hadn't realized anyone noticed. Used to watch a lot, she continued, not quite smiling. Now I just observe. Her words sat with me. I looked at her again, not as a customer, not as a delivery stop, but as a person who had clearly lived a lot of life. And somewhere along the way, life had quietly walked out the back door without saying goodbye. She didn't ask me to stay long. It's just enough to say a few things, to break the spell of stillness. I listened. She talked about the garden she hadn't touched in 3 years, the music she used to dance to, the way the winter always made her bones ache, but the silence was worse. And when I stood to leave, she said it not with a flirt, not with a cry, but with a small, almost scared hope in her voice. Would you come by again sometime, even if there's no prescription attached? Just to ... help the heart remember. I said yes. I didn't plan on going back the next day. I had told her yes out of instinct, not obligation, and certainly not out of charity. There was just something in her eyes when she asked, not desperation. Not loneliness begging for attention, but a softness that pulled something from my chest I hadn't felt in years. A kind of quiet understanding that we were two people carrying something invisible. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about the way she said help the heart remember, as if her heart had been asleep and forgotten what it was like to be seen. And maybe mine had too. Morning came with heavy clouds and a bitter wind. It's the kind of day that made most folks pull their curtains tighter and cancel plans. I ran the usual delivery root cough syrup for a toddler on Elm Street, refills for a retiree with stories longer than his prescriptions, and a 2-pack of heartburn relief for the mayor's wife. My thoughts kept drifting back to Hawthorne Lane. No new delivery was scheduled for her, but I found myself turning onto that road anyway. I told myself I'd just drive past, see if maybe she was sitting near the window again. Just a glance, just a moment. But when I saw the curtain shift, just slightly, like someone was checking to see who might be outside, I pulled into the driveway. Without a second thought, she answered quicker this time, like she had been nearby. She wore a deep blue cardigan buttoned all the way up, her hair freshly brushed and gathered neatly behind her ears. Her face lit up when she saw me, and I felt something warm press against the base of my ribs, not excitement, not romance, but a comfort I didn't realize I'd been missing. She invited me in with a nod, and I followed her inside like I had been doing it for years. This time, the house smelled of cinnamon. A pot on the stove simmered gently, and soft instrumental music played from a speaker tucked behind a stack of books. She had made tea, said it helped her hands stop shaking in the cold, and offered me a cup before I could politely decline. I sat in the same chair as before, and she sat in hers. No grand fanfare, no forced smiles. Just two people settling into an unfamiliar comfort. She told me about her husband that day, not in the way most widows do, with tears or shaking voices, but as though she was dusting off a photo album with words. His name was Thomas. Quiet man with strong forearms and a love for crossword puzzles. He died 5 winters ago on a night not unlike the one I'd first arrived. She didn't linger on the sadness. She simply said the words like they were bricks in the wall of her life. She said grief had a strange way of changing the air in a house. First, it filled the rooms with noise memories crashing against silence, and then it slowly left, taking the color with it. Necessarily want the color back, necessarily. She just wanted someone to sit in the quiet with her, so it didn't feel like it was swallowing the place whole. I listened. That's all. No advice. No comparison stories. Just the sound of my presence meeting hers. She asked me about myself. Next, gently, carefully, like she was holding out a hand and waiting for me to decide whether to reach back. I told her a little about how I used to work construction full-time, how my brother and I ran a small crew until he moved out west for love, about how the quiet job at the pharmacy started out as a way to make ends meet and became something I looked forward to. I told her about my mother, who passed the year before, and how I'd stopped visiting people after that, how conversations felt heavier, how I hadn't sat and talked to someone like this in I didn't finish that sentence. Didn't have to. The kettle whistled, and she rose to pour us both fresh cups. I noticed how she moved slow but deliberate, like each motion was part of a memory she didn't want to rush through. She handed me a mug with trembling fingers, but not from age. It was something deeper. Fragile, yes, but not broken. I sipped slowly, letting the warmth anchor me to the moment. She looked at me then, not with expectation, but with recognition, like she saw something familiar in me. Maybe I did too. The hours passed without urgency. She showed me a painting she had been working on half-finished, colors muted but hopeful. I helped her adjust a stuck window. We talked about books, about the way time changes things, and about the strange peace in watching snow fall when you're not in a rush to be anywhere. I'd never met someone who made time feel like it wasn't running out. Before I left, she placed a folded piece of paper in my hand. I opened it later in the truck. It wasn't a note. It was a poem. One she'd written years ago, she said, for someone she never gave it to. The lines were delicate, unsure, but beautiful in a way that only comes from pain stitched into something hopeful. It ended with the words, "If you stay long enough, you'll hear the heart hum again." I sat in the truck for a long while after that, heater humming, headlights catching flurries in the air. I didn't know what this was. Friendship? A kind of surrogate companionship? Something softer, quieter, more necessary than any category could define? All I knew was that I didn't want to pretend it didn't matter. Not to her. Not to me. The next day, I brought her soup, not from the pharmacy, not from a store, from my own kitchen. I hadn't cooked in months, but I found myself wanting to. Wanting to do something that didn't just fill her stomach, but reminded her and maybe reminded me that people still cared. That connections, no matter how unlikely, still formed in the unlikeliest places. And when she opened the door and saw me standing there, thermos in hand, she smiled in a way I hadn't seen before. Not wide, not dramatic, but with a quiet light that stretched across the lines of her face like sunlight warming old wood. She stepped aside, motioned me in without a word. And I knew then Nee wasn't just delivering medicine anymore. I was returning to something that felt almost sacred. A space where healing had started to echo back. There's a strange kind of comfort that settles in when two people stop pretending. That's what it felt like with Lenara. Like neither of us had the energy or interest to polish the surface of who we were anymore. There were no masks, no social graces, just realness. Quiet, honest, and sometimes awkward. When I brought her soup that afternoon, I didn't expect her to be anything more than appreciative. But as we sat in her kitchen, the steam rising between us and the wind pushing against the windows, it felt like I had walked into a room where something forgotten had begun to wake up. Her kitchen was a time capsule in the best way, honey-colored. Cabinets with rounded edges, ceramic mugs collected from flea markets, a small radio with the paint peeling from its dials. The linoleum had faded in the places where she must have stood the most, near the stove and the sink. A chipped teacup sat on the sill with dried lavender sprigs in it. It didn't feel like a place abandoned by time. It felt like a place that had waited patiently for someone to return. She moved slower that day, holding her shoulder like it had been aching all morning. I offered to carry the soup pot to the table, and she didn't protest. That was new before. She seemed hesitant to let me do much. But now, she nodded and stepped aside like she was starting to trust me with the little things. We ate in mostly silence. The occasional comment about the cold, or how the potatoes were soft just right. It wasn't conversation, it was communion, a shared space. A meal served with something much heavier than broth and vegetables. Afterward, she stood by the window and looked out at the bare branches of the oak trees behind her home. Her voice, when it came, was more memory than sound. She spoke about how winter used to mean something else, how it was once a time of card games, layered blankets, and the sound of her husband's off-key singing while shoveling snow. She said, Thomas used to complain about the cold every year, but never missed a morning of clearing the path for her. He grumbled with love, she said, and I knew exactly what she meant. I asked if she still heard him sometimes. Not in the ghostly sense, but in the everyday echoes. She smiled, eyes glassy, and said she often forgot whether a sound in the house was real or remembered. A cupboard closing, a chair creaking, a laugh down the hall. "Maybe that's the mercy of love," she said. "It leaves shadows that keep you company, even after the person is gone." She showed me a photograph that day. It had been tucked in a drawer she hadn't opened in years. Black and white, with creases along the edges and a stain in the corner. It was her and Thomas, probably in their 30s, standing beside an old truck and smiling like the world couldn't touch them. She wore her hair in curls then, and he had the kind of grin that told you he laughed with his whole chest. Looked at it like she was seeing herself through a stranger's eyes. I watched her thumb trace the outline of his face, and for a moment, the silence between us was so heavy, I could feel it in my throat. Then she handed it to me, just like that, said I should hold on to it for a while, so someone else remembers, she whispered. I didn't know what to say. I folded it gently into my coat pocket, as if it were made of glass. We spent that afternoon in a rhythm I hadn't experienced in years, not rushed, not choreographed, just existing together. She showed me her bookshelf, filled with titles that smelled like dust and adventure. I read aloud to her for a while, my voice bouncing off the walls with the words of someone else's story. She closed her eyes and let the words wash over her, nodding at the familiar ones, smiling when a phrase reminded her of something. At one point, she leaned back in her chair and said, without looking at me, "You know, Jonah, I think I stopped. Expecting kindness a long time ago became easier not to hope. But then you showed up. Not because anyone asked you to stay, but because you did." Her voice broke a little. That matters. It's more than I ever let on. I sat there, unsure how to respond, but feeling more seen in that moment than I had in a long time. I hadn't come to be her savior. I didn't want to wear the weight of her healing like a badge. But what I did want, what I was slowly realizing, was to be part of her world, even if only for a little while longer. Before I left that evening, she handed me a small box. "Something for the road," she said, as if she had been waiting for the right moment. Inside was a stack of note cards, each one with a quote or a line she had scribbled down over the years. Wisdom from novels, overheard phrases at the diner, her own late-night thoughts. They were yellowed at the edges, soft. From years of being handled, I thumbed through a few of them when I got home, and one stuck out. Loneliness doesn't always come from being alone. Sometimes it comes from being unseen. That night I couldn't sleep again. Not because of restlessness, but because my mind was full. Full of the sound of her voice, the shape of her smile, the way her home seemed to wake up when someone stepped inside. I thought about how many people we pass by every day, never knowing how close they are to fading, and how a simple delivery something so mechanical, it's forgettable, could become the thread that ties to people back to the world again the next morning. I didn't wait for a reason to go back. I stopped by the pharmacy, picked up a few essentials she hadn't asked for but might appreciate: a heating pad, some chamomile tea, and a new notepad, and drove to her home like it was the only place I needed to be. Opened the door already. Smiling, no hesitation this time, no flicker of doubt. Just open arms and a house that no longer felt like a waiting room for grief. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She invited me in before I even spoke. Her sweater was bright today, something with flowers stitched across the chest. The house smelled like something baking banana bread, or maybe cinnamon aganned. There was a vase of fresh flowers on the kitchen table. She said she'd gone to the market that morning. Felt like having a reason to pick something out, she said with a small shrug. We sat again in the kitchen, but this time we laughed more. She told me about her neighbor's loud dog, the one who howled at sirens but never barked at strangers. I told her about my old fishing trips with my brother, the time we caught a tire and tried to convince our dad it was a record-breaking bass. We weren't two strangers anymore. We were a rhythm, a pattern forming in the quiet. That day she didn't talk about Thomas. I didn't ask. Not because I didn't care, but because I think healing doesn't always need words. Sometimes it's just in the showing up. In the chair left pulled out, the extra cup of tea steeping quietly beside the first, I started keeping Hawthorne. Laying on my regular route, even if Lenora had no prescription due. The pharmacy didn't question it. Mrs. Callahan simply gave me a look one morning while handing me the delivery clipboard. A small smile in the corner of her mouth, like she knew without asking. Waverly Falls was a town that noticed things. Quietly, politely, but it noticed. And lately, people seemed to smile a little more when they saw me pass. It's like maybe they sensed something changing, even if they didn't know what. I'd never had a ritual before, but mornings with Lenora were starting to feel like one. I began showing up with small things books I thought she'd enjoy. Muffins. From the bakery to streets over, a new pair of knit gloves when the frost bit harder than usual. She didn't ask for these things. But the way her face softened each time I appeared told me they mattered. We didn't speak about it much, what we were building, because I think we were both afraid that naming it might break the spell. Instead, we let it become what it wanted to become, moment by moment, breath by breath. One afternoon, a week or so after the banana bread day, I arrived to find the front door slightly ajar. That wasn't like her. She was careful about locks, especially since winter set in. I hesitated, called her name lightly from the porch. No answer. The wind stirred the trees, and a crow cawed in the distance, unsettling the silence around me. I stepped in, the floor creaking beneath my feet, the warmth of the house brushing my skin. The fireplace was lit, logs crackling faintly, and I could hear the faint clatter of movement from deeper inside. "Lenora," I called again, this time with more concern. Then she appeared at the end of the hall, wearing a dark green coat and holding a pair of boots in one hand. Her hair was loose for once, flowing gently around her shoulders. She looked startled at first, then smiled. "Oh, Jonah," she said, sounding breathless. "I was just coming to get something from the shed out back. I must have left the door open. Come in before the cold swallows you." Relief settled in my chest as I stepped closer, shaking off snow from my coat. I helped her into the boots, her hands trembling a little as she tried to balance. She laughed softly. My body remembers how to do things, but not always the timing. She wanted to show me something in the shed, garden bench Thomas had built decades ago, now collecting dust and cobwebs. Said she thought it might be time to bring it back to life, maybe place it near the bird bath that hadn't seen water. Since the fall, it took us some effort to pull the bench out. The wood groaned and rust flaked off the hinges, but her eyes lit up like a child seeing a long-lost toy. We carried it together awkwardly, our footsteps leaving uneven trails in the snow. She insisted we prop it up against the porch just to feel the sunlight again. When we finished, she stood back, breathing hard, her cheeks flushed red and eyes wet, not from cold, but from memory. "He made this the summer after my father died," she whispered. "Said I needed somewhere to rest while the world spun mad. I never sat on it after he passed. I didn't say anything. Just gently dusted off the armrest and motioned for her to sit." She hesitated, then slowly lowered herself onto the wood. It creaked, but held. And when she looked up at me, it was as if something inside her had settled. "It's time," she said simply. Later that afternoon, we didn't return inside right away. We sat on the bench with mugs of warm cider and let the silence stretch comfortably. The snow fell gently around us, catching in her hair, softening the lines of her expression. I watched as she reached out and touched the edge of the bench like it was sacred. Maybe it was. Maybe it had been waiting just as much as she had, for someone to sit beside her again. She started speaking of things I hadn't heard from her. Before, bits of her childhood, how her mother sang to her when the storms rolled in. How she once dreamed of opening a small bookshop filled only with poetry and old jazz records. "I was going to call it Verses and Vinyl," she said with a chuckle. But life had other plans. It hit me then how much of her had been folded away for safekeeping. Years of dreams and memories and longings tucked into corners, wrapped in quiet and silence. And yet, here she was, unwrapping them one by one, offering them to me like fragile gifts. Not because she expected me to fix anything, but because I was still there. She told me that day something I won't forget. "You know, healing doesn't always announce itself, Jonah. It doesn't come with trumpets or a finish line. Sometimes it just looks like a bench moved back to the porch, or a conversation that doesn't need to be rushed." We sat until the light began to fade, and with some effort we returned inside. I made us both tea and reheated a casserole she'd prepared the day before. There was a comfort now in our movements, a shared choreography that required no words. I was starting to learn her rhythms, the way she hummed under her breath when thinking, how she always paused before opening the fridge, like trying to remember what memory might spill out. That night, before I left, she walked me to the door and did something she hadn't before. She touched my hand, not a shake, not a grab, just a soft press of her fingers to mine. "Thank you," she said, voice low, for giving the house a reason to breathe again. And as I walked back to my truck, her silhouette lingered in the doorway, framed by soft light and shadows. It occurred to me then that, whatever this was, whatever we were shaping together, it had become something more than companionship. It was a shared healing, a rediscovery. For both of us, I drove home slowly that night, the road blurring in places from the snow and something heavier behind my eyes. I didn't know where this was going. I didn't need to. All I knew was that some part of me had stopped drifting, and it had happened on a porch next to a bench beside a woman who once thought she had run out of reasons to speak. There's a strange shift that happens when you start building a place in someone's routine, not through grand gestures, but through presence, through consistency. That week, Lenora and I fell into a rhythm neither of us ever officially agreed on. I would show up mid-morning, usually with something, and hand a new scarf I'd picked out at the local market, a collection of poems bound in cracked leather, or sometimes nothing at all. Sometimes I just brought myself. Somehow that was enough. She never asked me to come. But every time I stepped onto her porch, the door opened before I could knock. Her home had changed. Not visibly at first glance, but in spirit, the air. It felt lighter, the corners less burdened by silence. She started putting out 2 mugs instead of 1, warming both with boiling water before pouring in the tea. There were fresh flowers on the table more often, sometimes from the store, sometimes from her yard, where sprigs of wintergreen still poked through the fading frost. Her record player, once silent under a stack of dusty novels, now played soft tunes while we sat and read or talked or simply existed beside each other. One day she laughed and said she hadn't played Nat King Cole in years. I told her his voice suited the quiet. Our conversations took on new colors. We stopped dancing around the edges of who we used to be. She told me things that had long sat sealed inside her, like the way she always regretted not painting a mural in the hallway, or how she used to stay up late on purpose just to listen to Thomas breathe in his sleep. He made the world feel steady, she said, even when everything else wobbled. There was something in her eyes when she said that not just loss, but gratitude too. She had known deep love. That kind of thing leaves echoes that never fade, no matter how many winters pass. I shared pieces of myself too, bit by bit. Told her about a time I almost moved to Seattle with someone I thought I'd marry, before we both realized we weren't. Trying to build the same kind of life. Told her how my father used to whistle while fixing things, even if he was terrible at it, and how sometimes I still find myself doing the same when I'm working alone. I don't think I realized how much I'd kept to myself over the years until she started asking in that quiet way of hers, not pressing, just inviting. One morning the air carried that strange in-between scent, part winter, part spring, the kind that made the skin on your arms tighten with cold, but your chest lift like something was blooming. I brought over a small packet of seeds for her garden, just a gesture. Marigolds and lavender and something called forget-me-not that felt too poetic not to pick up. She held the packet like it was fragile glass, then set it carefully on the windowsill. "Next season," she said. "That's what we'll call it," but not everything was light. Healing never is. That same afternoon, as we were sharing coffee and scones near the fireplace, something shifted in her mood. Her voice slowed, her eyes drifted toward the photo shelf. There was one picture I hadn't asked about, small, old, slightly off-center, placed behind a larger frame. It showed a young girl on a swing set, hair flying, smile wide and blurred. In motion, Lenora stared at it for a long time. "She was mine," she said finally, her voice so quiet I wasn't sure I heard her right at first. "A daughter, Julia." I stayed silent, letting her continue. "She was born on the first day of spring, Thomas said she smelled like warm rain. She had his laugh too, and his eyes. She passed before her 8th birthday. Some kind of infection that moved too fast. We were hours too late. Her words didn't break. They didn't crumble into tears or dissolve into sobs. They were smooth stones dropped gently into water. But the ripples they created were wide and aching. She used to sing to the sun, she said after a moment. Would stand at the window and just hum nonsense while it rose. I never recorded it. I thought I'd always remember. My heart clenched with a kind of ache I hadn't felt in years. Loss like that doesn't age. It just hides in corners until the light catches it. I reached across the small space between us and gently placed my hand over hers. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. She just looked at me, eyes damp but steady, and let the moment hold. Us both. We didn't talk much more that day. We just sat with the fire and the music and the weight of everything unspoken. I left later than usual, not wanting to disturb the stillness that had wrapped around the house like a blanket. The next morning, I returned with something different. Not a book, not a pastry, but a small hand-carved music box I'd kept for years. I didn't even remember where I got it, maybe from my mother's things, maybe a gift from someone long gone. When you wound it, it played a quiet, slightly off-key version of You Are My Sunshine. I hadn't opened it in years, but that day I brought it with me and handed it to her without a word. She opened the lid, heard the soft melody, and something shifted behind her eyes. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply placed the box beside the picture of Julia and let the song play all the way through. That night I dreamed of the garden, of lavender growing beneath her porch, of sunlight catching on the swing set that no longer stood in her yard, and of Lenora, standing in the doorway, smiling not because she had been healed, but because the ache no longer pressed against her ribs with every breath. The days that followed grew longer. The frost retreated from the edges of her lawn. Sun stayed a few minutes more each evening. And little by little, her house began to hum again, not with noise, but with life. The chair I always used was now draped with a second blanket. The pantry had my favorite tea in it. Her stove cooked for two, even on days when I hadn't said I was coming. She never asked me what we were. Never labeled it. I didn't either. Some connections don't need a name. They just exist, fuller than friendship, gentler than romance, more sacred than either, when born from shared quiet. The day I arrived and found her pruning the hedges outside in the sunlight. Hair tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat, I smiled wider than I had in years. She looked up at me, wiped her brow, and grinned. "Told you the heart remembers," she said. And I knew then we weren't just passing time anymore. We were building something. Together, the following week brought a softness that neither of us spoke about directly, but both felt growing quietly between us. It was the kind of change that doesn't announce itself with declarations or dramatic shifts, but rather seeps into the ordinary moments until one day you look around and realize everything feels different. Lighter somehow. Her house, once a museum of memories frozen in time, had turned into a place where new ones were forming. The difference wasn't loud, it was subtle, but it was everywhere. The hallway smelled faintly of orange peels and cinnamon. The kitchen counter bore the clutter of two people living rather than one person coping. And the silence that once echoed through her home now settled around us like a familiar blanket. That morning, I arrived to find Lenora kneeling in her backyard, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows and a small trowel in her hand. She looked up with a grin, dirt smudged on her cheek, and her hair held back by a faded blue bandana. "You're just in time," she said, motioning to a row of small potted seedlings lined up on the back step. "We're starting our garden today?" I knelt beside her, and without a word she handed me a pair of gloves and pointed toward an empty patch of soil near the fence. We worked for hours under a pale spring sun, digging, planting, patting down earth like we were tucking small dreams into bed. The marigolds were her favorite, she said, because they always looked like they were smiling. I told her lavender reminded me of the summer trips I used to take with my grandparents, where the scent followed you home on your clothes and made everything feel a little more magical. Somewhere, Between planting the last row and rinsing our hands at the spigot, she said, "I never thought I'd have this again." Her voice was low, thoughtful, as if she hadn't meant to say it out loud. The small things, the mess of it. The joy and dirt under my nails. After Thomas, it felt like all the colors had bled out of life. Like every day was just another canvas. Of gray, but now, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Later that day, she invited me to stay for dinner. Not just a quick cup of soup or a slice of pie, but a full meal. She set the table with care, pulling out placemats she hadn't used in years, and lighting a single candle in the center. "Old habits," she said with a shrug, though the glint in her eyes told me it meant more. "Help prepare the food, Rosemary. Chicken, mashed potatoes, sautéed green beans, and..." We moved around each other in the kitchen like we'd done it 100 times before. There was music playing on the record player again, something soft and jazzy. And her laughter filled the corners of the room like sunlight finding its way through old curtains as we ate. She told me more about her past, not the pain this time, but the funny, beautiful things she'd kept close to her chest. Like the time she and Thomas got lost on a road trip and ended up spending the night in their car, laughing under the stars and eating vending machine crackers. Or how she once danced barefoot in the rain outside this very house just because. The thunder reminded her of an old song she used to love. "I think grief tricks you," she said at one point. Her fork paused in midair. "It makes you believe that your best memories are behind you. But you'll never feel that kind of happiness again. But then someone walks into your life with medicine, in silence, and a smile that doesn't ask anything from you. And suddenly, you start to wonder if maybe the heart still has room." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't try to fill the space with words. Instead, I reached across the table and placed my hand gently over hers, the flickering candlelight. Reflecting off her silver bracelet, her fingers curled around mine like they'd been waiting to do that for a long time. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. If this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." After dinner, we moved to the living room and sat by the fire. She handed me a small notebook, well-worn, with pages filled edge to edge in tiny script. "This is where I kept all the things I was afraid to say out loud," she said.
"All letters?"
"The first wrote but never sent. Thoughts I couldn't share with anyone, not even Thomas." I hesitated, unsure if she truly wanted me to read it. But she nodded once and said, "Start anywhere." So I did. I flipped to a random page and began reading softly, my voice slow and respectful. The words were raw and beautiful lines about feeling invisible, about aging in a world that only notices youth, about the ache of missing someone so much that you start speaking to their picture like it can answer back. There were also parts about hope, tentative and delicate, but real. Hopes that someone might sit beside her one day and not try to fix her. Just hold the quiet with her. She listened with her eyes closed, and I could see a tear slide down her cheek, though she didn't brush it away. When I finished the page, she opened her eyes and smiled at me. And it was the kind of smile that lives in the in-between space of sorrow and grace. "You've seen more of me in a month than most people have in years," she said, "and you haven't run away." I gave her a small smile and said, "Sometimes the heart just knows when it's supposed to stay." The next morning, as I pulled into her driveway, I saw her sitting on the bench we'd rescued weeks earlier, bundled in a knitted shawl with a cup of tea in her hands. She looked peaceful, like she belonged in the morning light. Joined her without a word, and we sat together, listening to the birds and the wind chimes, and the soft hum of a new day arriving. It was then that she turned to me and said something I hadn't expected. "Jonah, if I asked you to stay in it just for coffee, not just for conversation, but really stay, would you?" The question hung in the air, not desperate or urgent, but gentle and terrifying in its honesty. I looked at her, at the lines on her face that told stories, at the steadiness in her gaze that asked nothing and everything all at once. And though I wasn't sure what staying would look like, I knew in that moment that leaving wasn't an option. "Yes," I said quietly, as if anything louder would shatter the moment. "Yes, I would." And she leaned her head on my shoulder, the cup still warm between her hands, and whispered, "Then maybe this is the season I finally start again." It was strange how quickly something could shift when spoken out loud. A question like hers, so simple, so unadorned, and yet so profound, had the power to loosen something that had been coiled tight inside me for years. That night, I didn't go home. I stayed, not out of obligation, not out of fear she would break if I left, but because I wanted to. We didn't talk much after I said yes. She didn't ask me to unpack a bag or move things into drawers. Just sat there, shoulder to shoulder on that old bench, until the stars came out and the wind softened into a hush. It wasn't about making a decision. It was about recognizing what had already been unfolding quietly between us day by day. In the days that followed, my routine shifted like they'd been waiting for permission. I still handled deliveries, but I adjusted my schedule. The pharmacy didn't question it. In a town like Waverly Falls, people noticed when someone started smiling more. I was still Jonah, still the man who showed up on time and carried other people's medications through snow or rain. Now I also brewed a second cup of tea each morning. I learned the sound of her footsteps upstairs and the way her house creaked in approval when she moved through it with purpose again. I learned how she liked her towels folded, and that she always lit a candle after a storm, as if to push back against the leftover dark. One morning, I came downstairs to find her, humming in the kitchen barefoot, her robe tied loosely around her waist. She was cooking scrambled eggs and buttered toast, the simple aroma curling around the room like memory. I used to do this every Sunday, she said, without turning around. Even when it was just me, it made the house feel less hollow. Stood at the doorway watching the way the early light wrapped around her figure, and I thought to myself that this moment, this quiet shared domesticity, was something I hadn't realized I missed. Not the grandeur of love, not the heat of infatuation, but the presence of someone else in your world. Someone who made space for you without having to rearrange everything first, after breakfast. We went through old photo albums together. She pulled them out from a cedar chest in the attic, brushing off dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. The first one was filled with black and white photos her parents in their youth. The house when the garden was still wild with roses. And a picture of Lenora at 16 with wind-blown hair and a shy smile. I always thought I looked too serious, she said, tracing the photo with one finger. But Thomas used to say it was my thinking face, said I was always halfway into the future. She handed me another album, this one in color, fading. At the edges, there was her wedding day, captured in soft grain and golden tones, and Julia, year after year, growing older until the photos stopped too soon. We didn't speak much while we looked. Some stories don't need narration, sometimes. You just need to witness. At one point she looked over at me and said, "Is it strange that this feels like sharing a sacred text?" I shook my head. "Not strange at all," I told her. "But it feels like honoring something." That afternoon, I began fixing the small things around the house she hadn't touched in years. The squeaky cupboard in the kitchen, the window that never quite closed right in the den, the loose tile by the back door. She watched me work with an amused smile, sometimes handing me tools I didn't ask for, sometimes offering advice that made me pause and chuckle. "I may not know how to fix a leaky pipe," she said once, "but I know how to read a man pretending he does." She teased gently like that more often now, and her laughter had grown bolder. Not louder necessarily, but freer, less hesitant. One night while we were sitting by the fire, she leaned over and whispered, "Do you realize you've made this place breathe again?" I looked at her, about to offer some humble shrug, but she stopped me with a hand on my knee. "I mean it. This house my life fit was like a clock that had stopped ticking. And now I hear the seconds again." That evening, we danced. No music at first, just a whim. I offered her my hand as she was walking past me to the kitchen, and she raised an eyebrow. "Are you serious?" I nodded. "Always." So she placed her hand in mine, and we swayed in the dim light, moving slowly as if time had softened just for us. She laid her head against my chest, and I felt her sigh, one of those deep, level exhales that seems to push grief out with. When the record player began humming an old jazz tune, we just kept dancing, letting the notes stitch us closer. Of course, not every day was perfect. There were quiet mornings where she drifted into memory too far to return quickly. I'd find her staring out the window, her tea untouched, a look in her eyes that belonged to a different decade. I didn't interrupt. I just sat beside her and waited. Sometimes that was all she needed to know. Someone was there without pulling. Her back too soon. One particularly cold evening, we lost power. The wind had howled all day, and by dusk, the entire block had gone dark. She lit candles with a practiced hand, and we huddled beneath quilts in the living room, the fireplace our only heat. She pulled out an old deck of cards and we played. Rummy by candlelight, our shadows flickering on the walls like old film. Somewhere in the middle of the second game, she looked at me with a mischievous smile and said, "You know, if you were just delivering medicine, you're awfully overqualified." I grinned. "Well, maybe I specialize in long-term prescriptions." She laughed, a real hearty laugh that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. That night, as the wind calmed and the house fell into a hush, she reached for my hand beneath the blankets and whispered, "Stay just a little longer." And I did. Weeks passed like that, each one layering over the last like sheets of music, composing a song neither of us had expected to write. The routine deepened into a kind of quiet intimacy that needed no labels. She began humming again in the mornings. I began sleeping better at night. The ache that used to settle in my chest, the kind that comes from drifting through life without anchor, started to dissolve, and sometimes, she wasn't looking, I'd catch myself watching her. Not with desire, not in the way of fairy tale endings or youthful fire, but with a kind of reverence, a quiet awe at the way she rebuilt her life, one breath, one moment at a time, and somehow, in the process, taught me how to rebuild mine. The thing about peace is that you rarely recognize it when it first arrives. It doesn't knock or declare itself. It just starts settling into the spaces you thought would always remain. Hollow. That's how it was between Lenora and me. What had started as a simple delivery, in a moment of kindness, had grown roots, quietly at first, then deeper. It wasn't romance the way the world usually defines it. There were no passionate outbursts, no dramatic confessions, no promises sealed beneath moonlight. It was softer, more honest. It was two people rediscovering how to live in the presence of another without fear of being too much or not enough. One morning, I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the roof, steady and rhythmic, like a gentle reminder that the world was still turning. I found Lenora in the kitchen, wrapped in her long cardigan, pouring coffee into two mismatched mugs. She looked up and smiled as if we'd been doing this forever. "I didn't want to wake you," she said. "You looked peaceful." I took the mug from her hands and kissed her temple without thinking. It wasn't a declaration, just an instinct. And she leaned into it with a softness that said everything. We sat at the kitchen table watching the rain fall in silver lines across the yard. The garden we'd planted together weeks ago now bloomed with color even under the gray sky. The marigolds stood proud, the lavender swayed gently, and the forget-me-nots clung to the soil like they understood the importance of being remembered. She reached for my hand without looking and said, "Sometimes I forget this isn't a dream." "It's not," I said, "but it's allowed to feel like one." There were moments of uncertainty, of course. Healing is not linear. It's a slow dance between old wounds and new beginnings. Some evenings, she would pull away not rudely, just quietly. She'd retreat into the bedroom early or go for a walk alone at dusk. I learned not to follow. I learned to give her space without taking it personally. I knew enough of grief to understand that sometimes solitude is not loneliness, but a form of respect for what came before. One night she came back from one of those walks soaked from unexpected rain. I handed her a towel and watched as she peeled off her cardigan, laughing at her own damp state. "I needed to talk to him," she said, not looking at me. "Not because I don't care about what's happening between us, but because I do." I waited, letting her finish at her own pace. I told him I'm not replacing him, that what we had was its own kind of forever. And that this, you and me, it's something different. Something I never thought I'd be ready for again. Her voice broke a little then, not from sadness, but from the enormity of the truth. I crossed the room, wrapped the towel around her shoulders, and pulled her into my chest. She didn't cry. She just breathed against me, letting the moment be what it was, a gentle reconciliation between the past and the present. There was an afternoon not long after that when we decided to take a drive, no destination in mind. We packed a small picnic and let the winding roads guide us. The town blurred into countryside, then into quiet hills and open fields. We found a secluded spot beneath a large oak tree and spread a blanket across the grass. The air smelled of wild flowers and sun-warmed earth, and the only sounds were bird song and the whisper of wind in the trees. She lay beside me, head resting on my chest, eyes half closed. "You know," she said, "I used to think love was only valid if it came with a wedding, a mortgage, and anniversaries. But I don't need those things to know what this is." I nodded, brushing her hair back gently. "Love isn't measured in milestones," I said. "It's measured in mornings like this." We stayed until the sun began its descent, casting the fields in gold and amber. The drive back, we played old songs on the radio, sometimes singing along, sometimes just listening. She rested her hand on my knee as I drove, and I felt more at home in that car than I ever had in any house I'd lived in. That night, as we curled into bed, she turned to me and whispered, "I want you to know something." I opened my eyes and waited. "When I asked you to stay, I didn't think you would. I thought it was just one of those things you say when you're lonely and half laughing, but you did. You stayed, and it changed everything." I reached for her hand beneath the sheets and gave it a gentle squeeze. "I didn't stay out of pity, Lenora. I stayed because it finally felt like I wasn't the one doing the healing. I was being healed too." She didn't respond. Her silence was full of understanding, and the way she curled closer said more than any words could. The next few days passed in a haze of shared chores, slow afternoons, and quiet joy. I taught her how to make my grandmother's biscuit recipe, though hers turned out better. She showed me how to prune roses without getting stabbed by their thorns. We fixed the squeaky porch swing together, and in the evenings we'd sit there, beneath a sky full of stars, sipping wine and talking about nothing and everything. Then, one morning, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from her sister, whom she hadn't spoken to in years. The handwriting was familiar but tentative, the envelope thick with unsaid words. Lenora opened it slowly, reading in silence while I waited nearby. When she finished, she looked up. With tears in her eyes, "She wants to visit," she said. She said she's sorry it took losing everything to realize what she'd left behind. I placed a hand on her shoulder. "Do you want her to come?" She nodded slowly. I do. I think it's time." It was another step forward. Another piece of her life, reclaiming its place. That evening, she stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes, humming a tune I didn't recognize. I leaned against the doorway and just watched her for a moment, this woman who had endured so much, yet still found a way to hum. This woman who had asked me to stay not because she needed saving, but because she was ready to be seen again. In that moment, I realized something important. Love, in its purest form, isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about standing beside someone while they rebuild. It's about being there, quietly, consistently, without agenda. And in doing so, finding that your own cracks begin to fill, your own wounds begin to knit. She turned and caught me watching, smiled and said, "What?" "Nothing," I said, walking toward her. "Just thinking how glad I am that I was the one on call that day." She smiled wider, reached up, and touched my cheek. "So am I, Jonah. So am I." The day her sister arrived felt heavier than expected. Not because Lenora hadn't prepared, she had, in her usual quiet way, tidying the guest room, folding fresh towels, even placing a small vase of daffodils by the window. But the air inside the house held something charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm, where everything waits in hushed anticipation. Lenora had barely spoken all morning. She moved through the rooms in near silence, checking drawers and fluffing pillows that didn't need fluffing, and I knew better than to interrupt. Some emotions are private, and reunions with old ghosts, no matter how hopeful, always come with complicated shadows. When the knock came, she froze mid-step, one hand still resting on the corner of the hallway table. I stood behind her, not close enough to crowd, but near enough to catch her if she stumbled. She drew a slow breath, squared her shoulders, and opened the door. There stood a woman in her late 50s, hair streaked with gray like Lenora's, eyes wide with a guilt that had been fermenting for years. They didn't speak at first. No tearful embraces, no dramatic monologues, just a long, searching look between them. A silent apology offered and almost accepted. "Hi, Nora," her sister said softly, the nickname rough in her throat. Lenora. Didn't smile, but she didn't close the door either. "Hi, Rachel. Come in." Just like that, the past walked back into the house. The afternoon was cautious. The three of us sat in the living room, sipping tea that went cold too quickly. Conversations tiptoeing around the edges of grief and regret. Rachel talked about her children, her life in Colorado, the things she had buried herself in to keep from reaching out. Lenora listened, her hands folded in her lap, nodding at the right moments, but rarely interrupting. Stayed quiet mostly. Sensing that my role was to simply hold the space, to be the steady presence that had become so familiar to Lenora over these past weeks. It wasn't until the sun dipped below the trees that Rachel finally said what needed to be said. "I should have been there when Julia passed. I should have come sooner, stayed longer, done more." Her voice cracked at the end, and she blinked hard against tears. "I was scared." "That's not an excuse, but it's the truth." Lenora stared at her for a long moment, then reached for her tea. "Grief makes cowards of us all," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I've had years to think about who showed up and who didn't. I was angry for a long time. But somewhere in the middle of all that silence, I realized that carrying that anger was just another form of mourning." Rachel wiped at her cheek. "Is it too late to fix it?" "No," Lenora said simply. "But it has to start with today. Not with apologies. Not with trying to patch over the past. Just today." And with that, something shifted. The air in the room softened. Rachel reached for her sister's hand, and this time, Lenora didn't pull away. Over the next few days, I watched them find a rhythm again, stilted at first, but slowly familiar. They cooked together, laughed in short bursts that grew more frequent, and retold stories that hadn't been shared in decades. Lenora even brought out an old scrapbook I hadn't seen yet. And they flipped through it together, filling the house with voices from a childhood I'd never known. One evening, while Rachel was in the shower, Lenora and I stood on the back porch watching the sky fade from peach to indigo. She leaned against the railing, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said finally, eyes still fixed on the horizon. "For what? For not making me do any of this alone." I stepped beside her, brushing her fingers with mine. "We're never alone, Lenora. You just didn't have someone to remind you of that until now." She smiled faintly. "I think I forgot what being seen felt like. Not just looked at. Really seen. It made that feel safe again." The next morning, after Rachel left with promises to write and visit more often, Lenora seemed lighter. She moved through the kitchen with an ease I hadn't seen before, humming an old tune and pausing every so often to look out the window at our now-blooming garden. I asked her how she felt. She paused, spoon in hand, then said, like something inside me unclenched, like a door that had been stuck for years finally opened. That afternoon, she handed me a small, cloth-bound journal. "I want you to have this," she said. "I've been writing in it every night since the first time you came here. It's not poetry or anything grand, just thoughts, moments. The little things I didn't want to forget." I turned the pages slowly, my name appearing more frequently as the entries went on. Notes about our dinners, our walks, the way I made her laugh when she least expected it. It was a map of our time. Together, drawn not in dramatic strokes, but in soft pencil lines and quiet gratitude. "I want you to keep writing in it," she said. "Even when I'm gone." I looked up sharply. "Don't talk like that." She smiled gently. "Not soon, but one day. And when that day comes, I want there to be a record of how two people saved each other just by being kind."
Hi.
"Speak." So I held her instead. The rest of that week unfolded like a series of soft waves, one quiet joy after another. We visited the local farmer's market where she introduced me to the woman who sold the best honey in the county and insisted I try the lavender-infused kind.
Ow.
We hosted a small dinner for two of her neighbors who'd watched our relationship unfold with interest, but never interfered. We spent an afternoon sorting through her attic, laughing at the outfits she used to wear and uncovering an old typewriter she swore she'd one day fix. One night, as we lay in bed beneath the quiet hum of the ceiling fan, she said, "You know, if you ever want to go back to your old life, I won't stop you." I turned to face her. "Lenora, my old life was a routine. This is a reason." She smiled in the dark, and I felt her hand find mine beneath the covers. "Then maybe we've both found what we weren't looking for." I kissed her forehead and closed my eyes, thinking about how healing isn't just about recovery, it's about rediscovery. And somehow, in the quiet corners of a life that once felt too empty, we had begun to rewrite the definition of what it meant to be whole. There was a new kind of silence in the house now, but it wasn't the kind that clung or weighed heavy in the corners. It was warm, like a soft hush after laughter, or the quiet shared between two people who no longer needed to fill every moment with sound to feel connected. Life with Lenora had settled into something almost sacred, not exciting in the way movies define love, not bound by grand gestures or ticking clocks, but something quieter, more enduring. We had created a rhythm all our own, our days blended with gentle consistency, shared breakfasts, brief separations while I ran deliveries, afternoon garden work, slow walks, evenings by the fire, and unhurried nights where nothing was expected. But presence? There were still new things I was learning about her. She had a habit of collecting smooth stones she found during walks and tucking them into windowsills like tiny sentinels. She couldn't fall asleep without the soft ticking of her vintage bedside clock, sound that once irritated me but had since become oddly comforting. She hated licorice, loved pineapple on pizza, and always read the ending of a book first before committing to the beginning. "I like to know where I'm going," she said once with a smirk, "even if I don't rush to get there." One late morning, I came home from a short run into town to find her sitting on the porch, a letter open in her lap and a faraway look in her eyes. She looked up as I approached, then held the letter out wordlessly. It was from Julia's old college roommate, someone Lenora hadn't heard from in nearly a decade. The letter was full of warm memories and gentle sorrow. Apparently, she'd only recently learned of Julia's passing and wanted to share how much Julia had impacted her life, the way she helped her through a difficult breakup, the late-night talks they had over tea, and how her laughter had lit up every room she walked into. Lenora read it again, aloud, her voice trembling slightly, and when she reached the last line, "She loved you more than words ever gave her credit." She folded the letter carefully, then pressed it against her chest. She didn't cry, but I saw the flicker of something behind her eyes, like a lantern burning softly through fog. She looked at me and said, "It's strange, isn't it, how someone else's memory of your child can make you feel like she's alive again for just a second?" I knelt beside her, rested a hand over hers, and said, "She's never been far." That afternoon, she asked me if I'd help her go through the rest of Julia's things. We hadn't touched that room since the first week I stayed, and though she'd walked past it dozens of times, she'd never opened the door. Now she was ready. It was a tender process, each box, a fragment of another life, filled with college notebooks, half-finished journals, thrifted jewelry, and a small clay sculpture Julia had made as a child of a bird with lopsided wings. Lenora held it up and chuckled. She said it was a phoenix, she said it wasn't broken, just becoming something else. We placed some things aside to donate, others to store, and a few we kept in a memory box we would eventually place in the garden beneath her favorite rosebush. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about honoring it while making space for what came next. That evening, we sat on the porch swing, the memory box between us, and she said, "I used to think healing would feel like forgetting, but it doesn't. It feels like remembering with less pain, like the wound finally scabbed over." Following weekend, we hosted a small dinner for some of Lenora's friends. Just for people, all older women from town, who used to play cards. Together before life scattered them in different directions. They brought wine and stories and laughed too loudly. I grilled in the backyard while the women caught up, their voices rising in nostalgic delight. Was the most alive I'd seen. Lenora in Weeks, her cheeks flushed with warmth, her eyes sparkling with shared history. One of the women, Margot, leaned over to me as Lenora stepped inside and said, "I don't know what you did, young man, but thank you. We thought we'd lost her for good after Julia." "She did all the hard work," I replied. "I just showed up." When the evening wound down and the last guest had hugged her goodbye, Lenora came out to the garden and sat beside me. Still holding the glass of wine she hadn't touched, she looked up at the stars brilliant that night, scattered across the sky like scattered seeds, and whispered, "I think I'm ready to write again." She hadn't mentioned her writing in weeks. Early on, she'd confessed that she used to publish essays in small magazines, often under a pseudonym, little meditations on grief, motherhood, aging, solitude. But she hadn't written anything since Julia died. "That's beautiful," I said. "What will you write about?" She looked at me, that slow, knowing smile spreading across her face. All of it. Not just about Julia, not just the sorrow, but how strange and wonderful it is to rediscover life at an age where everyone assumes the best parts are behind you. I want to write about how it's possible to bloom again, maybe not the same as before, but still something bright, something real. And so she did. She wrote in the mornings, usually outside, with a blanket over her lap and a notebook in hand. I'd watch her from the kitchen window sometimes, marveling at the stillness in her, the way she'd press the pen to the page and let the words flow, as if she were transcribing a truth she'd always known but never had the strength to speak. Sometimes she'd read her work aloud to me at night. Other times, she'd let it sit in the quiet, tucked away for another day. I realized then that healing wasn't just about stopping the bleeding it was about creating again. About finding purpose not in spite of your pain, but because of it. We weren't trying to outrun the past anymore. We were inviting it in, offering it a seat at the table, letting it inform the present without owning it completely. One evening, after a particularly vivid sunset, she turned to me and said, "I've started calling this chapter of my life the second spring. I think everyone should have one. A season where everything that once seemed dormant begins to stir again." "What am I in your second spring?" I asked, half joking. She didn't laugh. She looked at me with that unflinching gaze of hers, the one that always felt like it reached past skin and into marrow. "You're the water," she said. "You made the soil soft enough to grow something again." That night we danced again. In the living room, barefoot, no music, but the soft sound of her laughter and the rhythm of our hearts. And though no one else was there to see it, I'll remember that moment for the rest of my life, not because it was grand, but because it was true. The first cool breeze of fall drifted through the open window one morning as I stood at the stove, scrambling eggs, and the shift in the air felt almost symbolic. Summer had lingered long this year, as if unwilling to let go, but now the wind carried a crispness that signaled a change neither of us could ignore. I glanced over at Lenora, who was curled up on the couch in her robe, notebook resting on her knees, glasses perched low on her nose. She was already writing, her pen gliding steadily across the page, her expression still and focused. The morning light filtered in through the sheer curtains, catching the silver in her hair and making it glow. I paused just to look at her. She didn't notice me watching, but she didn't need to. That was the comfort we had found, presence. Without pressure, companionship without demand. That afternoon we drove out to a nearby orchard, a place she'd mentioned once in passing but hadn't visited in years. Rows of apple trees stretched out beneath a wide blue sky, their branches heavy with red and gold fruit. Children ran laughing between the trees, baskets swinging from their arms. While couples took photos and older folks reminisced over cider and donuts at picnic tables nearby. Lenora inhaled deeply when we stepped out of the truck, her eyes closing for a moment. "This place used to be our favorite," she said softly. "We came every fall, just me and Julia, She loved the cinnamon donuts most. She'd eat 2 before. We even left the parking lot. We wandered the orchard slowly, hand in hand, stopping now and then to pick apples, tasting 1 or 2 along the way. It wasn't a grand event. It was simple and ordinary, the kind of memory most people might forget by next year. But for Lenara, and now for me, it felt sacred. We sat on a bench beneath one of the trees as the late afternoon sun painted the leaves in gold. She leaned against my shoulder and whispered, "I never thought I'd feel joy here again." I kissed her forehead and said, "That's the thing about joy. Doesn't erase grief, just makes room beside it." Later that week, as we raked leaves in the front yard, a teenager on a bike stopped at the curb, hesitating. He was lanky, with shaggy brown hair and a shy posture. Lenora looked up first. "Evan," she called, surprised. The boy smiled awkwardly and waved. "Hi, Miss Callahan. I wasn't sure if you'd remember me. I used to live 2 houses down, moved away a couple years ago." She wiped her hands on her jeans and walked toward him. "Of course I remember you. You and Julia were in the same science club, weren't you?" Evan nodded. "Yeah, she helped me pass physics. Was terrible at it." They chatted for a few minutes, and Evan eventually asked if it was okay to visit the garden sometime. Said he'd heard from his mom that it had become something special. Lenora beamed. "You're welcome anytime," she said. "And bring your mom. We still have too many tomatoes to eat ourselves." After he left, she turned to me and said, "I forget sometimes how far her reach really was. Of herself and so many people." That night, we sat in the garden with mugs of tea, wrapped in blankets, as the stars slowly emerged above us. The wind rustled through the plants, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out, low and steady. "Do you ever think about the future?" she asked quietly, not looking at me. I sipped my tea and let the question sit between us for a moment. "I used to think about it all the time," I finally said. "But now, I think more about days, like today. I think about how lucky I am to sit here with you, under this sky after everything." She nodded slowly. "I used to plan everything. I had lists for my lists. But now, I just want to live whatever time I have left with intention. With grace." I placed my mug on the table beside us and reached for her hand. "You're doing that, Lenora, every single day?" She smiled faintly, her fingers curling around mine. "I'm just glad I didn't push you away that day on the porch. Part of me was so sure I should, but you didn't," I said. That changed everything. A few mornings later, I found her in the kitchen with a large envelope in her hands. She looked up at me, eyes bright. I submitted one of my essays to a magazine. One of the big ones. She paused, a little breathless, and they want to publish it. Next month? My heart leaped at the news. I crossed the room and pulled her into a hug. "Lenora, that's incredible." She laughed against my chest. They said they were moved by the vulnerability, that it felt honest. I wasn't even trying to impress anyone. I just told the truth. And that was the essence of hurt, truthful, raw, resilient. She had turned her pain into something useful, something beautiful. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was reaching, blooming, contributing again to the world in her own steady way. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about finding a voice that had been buried beneath years of silence and letting it rise again, full and clear. The day the magazine came in the mail, she held it like a fragile treasure. Her name printed in bold beneath the essay's title. "How to Bloom Again After You've Wilted." She read it aloud to me that evening, voice trembling only once. It was a piece about letting go of timelines, about giving yourself permission to begin again, no matter your age or your wounds. About how healing often looks nothing like people expect it's not dramatic or quick or shiny. It's slow, often. Quiet, and sometimes it comes in the form of someone knocking on your door with a paper bag full of medicine and staying just a little longer than they had to. She looked up at me when she finished reading, eyes glassy. "It's our story, isn't it?" she said. I nodded. Every word. And just like that, it felt as though the story we were living had rippled outward, touching people we'd never meet, reminding them that it's never too late to find softness, to let love in, to choose something new, Even after everything else has fallen away, we weren't rushing anymore. There was no need. Life was no longer something to race through. It was something to hold gently, like a bird in your hands alive, fluttering, fragile, full of potential. Winter announced its arrival with a cold wind that whistled through the trees and turned the sky a steely gray. The leaves had long since fallen, carpeting the yard in brittle amber. And I'd raked them into neat piles only for the wind to scatter them again. A futile but oddly meditative routine. Inside, the house took on a quieter rhythm. Mornings were slower, often beginning with the sound of the heater clicking on and the scent of cinnamon tea steeping in the kitchen. Lenora had begun wearing thick-knitted cardigans and fingerless gloves around the house, her notebook never far from reach. I, too, found myself settling into the season like someone curling into a favorite Cherno rush. No urgency, just presence. It had been nearly 3 months since I first knocked on her door with a small bag of prescriptions and a mind full of other errands. Now, that delivery felt like the soft push that sent both of our lives down a new path, one that neither of us had known we needed. Her garden was now dormant, but she tended to it each day as if the soil still held secrets. Even in rest. There's life underneath, she told me once, as she knelt beside the flower bed, brushing frost from the stone edging. The roots don't stop just because we can't see them. That idea stayed with me. So much of our healing had been invisible to the outside world. No dramatic revelations, no sweeping declarations, just the slow, steady repair of two hearts that had forgotten what softness felt like. Our days were stitched together by simple rituals. She'd read her essays aloud in the evenings, often stopping to scribble revisions in the margins. I took to cooking more elaborate dinners, experimenting with recipes we clipped from old magazines. One night I burned the garlic bread, and we ended up eating cereal on the couch, laughing until tears rolled down our cheeks. The mail became something we looked forward to, not just bills or junk flyers, but letters. Her published essay had touched more people than we'd expected, and soon envelopes began arriving. Handwritten in careful script from strangers who had read her words and felt less alone. Some were from widows, others from women nearing 50 who'd been afraid to admit how lonely they felt, even in full homes and long marriages. One woman simply wrote, "Thank you for reminding me that it's okay to begin again." Lenora. Read every single one, responding in her own time with words that were always kind but never overreaching. One particularly cold morning, I came into the living room to find her standing at the window, watching the snow begin to fall in slow, elegant flakes. She turned to me, eyes thoughtful. "Do you miss your old life?" she asked, the question sudden but not accusing. I took a moment to answer, crossing the room to stand beside her. "I don't," I said honestly. "I think I was only half awake back then. I was going through the motions, mistaking busyness for meaning. But here, with you, I feel like I'm part of something that matters." She didn't say anything for a long moment, but her hand reached for mine, our fingers intertwining. "Naturally, sometimes I worry I've kept you from something," she said quietly. "That I've rooted you here out of selfishness." I shook my head. "You didn't keep me from anything, Lenora. You gave me something I didn't know I needed. You gave me stillness, and purpose, and love." The word hung in the air between us. We didn't use it often, not because it wasn't true, but because we respected the weight of it. Ours wasn't a love of youth or haste. It wasn't built on fireworks or grand confessions. It was built on shared mornings and unspoken understanding, on knowing each other's silences as intimately as their voices. It was the kind of love that didn't ask for proof because it showed up every day in the way we listened, the way we made space for one another, the way we stayed. That evening, Lenora pulled an old box from the back of her closet. It was filled with holiday decorations she hadn't touched in years, ceramic angels, strings of popcorn from a Christmas long past, a wooden reindeer with one antler broken. "I haven't decorated in a long time," she admitted. Felt silly doing it. Alone, we spread everything out across the floor, sorting what still worked from what needed mending. We strung up the lights on the porch, wrapped garland around the staircase banister, and placed a small, artificial tree near the fireplace. where it cast a soft glow over the room each night. It wasn't extravagant, but it was enough. We hosted a quiet holiday dinner just for us, with roasted vegetables and a modest ham. And she wore a red sweater that had belonged to Julia. She loved Christmas, Lenora said, smiling gently. Said it was the only time the world felt soft again. After dinner, we exchanged small gifts hers. It was a leather-bound notebook with her initials engraved in gold. Mine was a wool scarf she'd knitted in secret over the past few weeks. It was slightly uneven, and all the more perfect because of it. As the new year crept closer, I found myself reflecting more often on what it meant to stay, on what I'd given up, on what I'd gained. There was a quiet pride in the way Lenora had slowly opened herself back to the world. She'd started teaching a writing workshop once a week at the local library, helping women her age and older find their voice again. She always came home with stories about the people she met. There's a woman in her 70s, she told me once, who writes the most heartbreaking poetry about her first husband. Not the one she married, but the one she lost in her 20s. She said she'd never shown them to anyone before. Isn't that wild? All that life locked away for decades? It struck me how much had been locked away in Lenora, too. And how gently it had all begun to unfurl. One evening, as we stood in the kitchen washing dishes together, she said, "Do you ever think this was always meant to happen? That maybe the universe kept circling us toward each other?" I paused, considering the question. "I don't know if I believe in fate," I said, "but I do believe in choices. We both made the choice to stay." She smiled at that. "That's better than fate, I think." Outside, the snow fell steadily. Inside, the fire crackled low. We moved through the house together like two notes of a song, distinct but in harmony, quiet but sure. And somewhere in the stillness, I realized that home wasn't just a place. It was a person. I had found mine. The first day of the new year arrived not with fireworks or champagne, but with a quiet snowfall that blanketed everything in a soft hush. Lenora stood by the window in her thick cardigan, sipping from a chipped blue mug as she watched the snowflakes dance their slow descent. She didn't say anything at first, and I didn't interrupt. I was sitting on the couch, flipping through a book I wasn't really reading, more tuned into the stillness of the morning than the words on the page. After a long moment, she finally spoke. "You know what I used to do on New Year's Day?" she asked, not turning away from the window. "I'd write a letter to myself. I'd talk about the past year, the good, the bad, what I learned, what I hope to carry forward. Then I'd seal it in an envelope and read it the following year, like time travel almost." I smiled at the idea. "Did you write one last year?" Shook her head. "No, I couldn't. It felt pointless then. Everything felt pointless." I put down the book and walked over to her. "Maybe this year is different." She looked at me then, really looked, and the soft line of her lips curled into a smile that was both grateful and a little bit sad. "Yes," she said quietly, "this year is different." We spent that afternoon writing our letters, not together in the same room, but separately, giving each other space. She sat at the dining table with her notebook, and I found a spot on the porch, wrapped in a blanket with a thermos of coffee beside me. The air was cold, biting at my fingers, but something about the silence made it easier to hear my own thoughts. I wrote about everything, the unexpected turn my life had taken, the ache I hadn't known I carried until I met Lenora, the peace I had found in staying, in slowing down, in loving without conditions. When I sealed the letter and wrote my name on the envelope, I felt a strange kind of pride, not in what I had achieved, but in who I was becoming. When we reunited later in the kitchen, Lenora slid her envelope into a small wooden box she pulled from the hutch. "These are the old ones," she said, patting the lid. "Maybe someday I'll be brave enough to read them again." She placed both our letters inside and locked it. "Next year," she said with a nod, "we'll read them together." That night, we lit candles and ate leftovers, and instead of resolutions, we made promises. Not to be perfect or productive or any of the things people usually aim for in January, but to be honest, to be present, to keep choosing each other in quiet ways. It felt more powerful than any resolution I'd ever made. In the weeks that followed, the days remained short and the evenings long. But something inside both of us had begun to stretch like a plant toward the light. Lenora's writing was no longer a private thing. She'd been invited to speak at a nearby women's group, and though she initially hesitated, she eventually said yes. "I don't want to hide anymore," she told me. "I want to be seen, even the parts that still hurt." I drove her to the event and waited in the back of the room as she stood behind a podium and read from her essay. Could see it in the way her fingers trembled against the pages, but as she spoke, something shifted. Her voice found its footing, and the room quieted with a collective stillness that only happens when people recognize truth in someone else's words. When she finished, there was a long pause before the applause began, and I watched as tears glistened in her eyes, not from pain, but from something closer to relief. Afterwards, women came up to her in small clusters, sharing their own stories, their own griefs, and second chances. I stayed off to the side, letting her have her space, but she kept looking back at me like I was her anchor in the storm. Later in the car, she reached over and took my hand. "I couldn't have done that without you," she said. I squeezed her fingers. "You did it all on your own." I just held the door open. A few days later, we got an invitation in the mail. It was from Julia's former high school, asking if Lenora would consider speaking at a remembrance event they were holding for alumni who had passed too soon. "They want me to talk about her," Lenora said softly as she read the letter. "Not as a statistic, but as a person." Her hands shook slightly as she held the envelope. "I don't know if I can." I sat beside her on the couch and waited a beat before answering. "You don't have to decide now," I said, "but if you do choose to speak, I'll be there, every second." She didn't reply right away, but I could tell the idea had planted itself. She'd never truly been offered a platform to talk about her daughter beyond the clinical or sympathetic. This was different. This was about celebrating her, about letting the world see the whole girl behind the tragedy. Over the next week, she started jotting things down, memories, quotes, stories, and, though she never said outright that she would do it, the notebook on her nightstand began to fill with things only a mother would remember. Meanwhile, my work as a delivery driver had shifted. I still kept up the occasional route, but my focus had changed. I'd begun fixing up odd jobs around town, small repairs that others had let sit too long. Sometimes I'd find myself in the homes of widowers or single mothers or quiet old couples who just wanted someone to talk to. I started to notice that what I did mattered more than what I earned. Lenora had taught me that. Service wasn't just a job, it was a way of life. One particularly icy evening, we returned from the grocery store to find the electricity out. The whole street was dark, and the wind howled through the trees. I lit candles while Lenora bundled up and pulled extra blankets onto the couch. We sat together, huddled under layers, eating soup we had reheated on the gas stove. It could have been miserable, but it wasn't. We laughed about how we felt like pioneers, made shadow puppets on the wall, and talked late into the night, long. After the candles had burned low, at one point in that flickering dark, she turned to me and said, "I never thought I'd be this happy again. I didn't think it was allowed after so much loss." I brushed a strand of hair from her cheek and whispered, "Happiness doesn't cancel out the grief, just shows us there's still room for light." She rested her head on my chest and breathed in deeply, and for the first time in years, I think she truly believed it. That night, I realized something else, something quiet and true and impossible to ignore. I hadn't just helped her heal, she had healed me too, without words, without demands, without even knowing it. She had reminded me that life was not meant to be outrun or managed. It was meant to be felt fully, painfully, joyfully. And sometimes, if we're lucky, we get to share it with someone who makes the weight of it feel like a gift. The end of January came with a sharpness that lingered. It's not just in the air, but in the bones. The cold pressed in with a certain finality, the kind that made the world feel quieter, more reflective. The frost etched delicate patterns on the windows each morning, and the streets wore a blanket of brittle white that crunched under boots, and tires alike. In the stillness of these frozen days, Lenora and I began to fall into an even gentler rhythm, waking slowly. Moving through routines not out of necessity but out of care, we'd become fluent in each other's silences, in the small glances, the passing touch of a hand on a shoulder. The way we could share a room and not feel the need to fill it with words. It was during one of those muted mornings when the letter came from Julia's former school again, this time, not just with an invitation, but with a formal program attached. Lenora had been quiet about it the past few days, retreating inward a little more with each passing evening. She wasn't avoiding me, not quite. But there was something heavier sitting on her, a weight she hadn't yet figured out how to carry. When she opened the envelope, she sat down slowly at the kitchen table, hands trembling slightly as she traced her daughter's name printed on the program. It wasn't large or elaborate, just simple black ink on soft cream paper. But it was enough to make her eyes brim. I didn't speak. I just sat across from her, waiting until she was ready to meet my gaze. "I want to do it," she said after a long silence, her voice low and resolute. "But I'm scared." "What scares you most?" I asked gently. "That I'll cry the whole time," she replied. "That I'll fall apart up there in front of all those people. I'll embarrass her memory instead of honoring it." Reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. "Crying doesn't mean you're weak. Falling apart in front of people who knew her. That's not shameful. That's human." She nodded slowly, but her eyes didn't leave the program. "I just want to do her justice. She deserves that much." Over the following days, she began to write her speech, not all at once, but in fragments. Memories, quotes, stories she hadn't told anyone in years. Some made her smile. Others made her pause and press her hand over her heart as if to quiet it. I didn't read over her shoulder or ask for previews. I just made sure the tea stayed hot, the room stayed quiet, that when she needed to look up and see someone there, I was. It was during this preparation that we started taking evening walks again, bundled up in scarves and coats, our breath hanging like smoke in the fading light. The snow had begun to melt slightly during the day and then freeze again overnight, leaving the sidewalks glazed and glittering. We'd move slowly, arms looped together, more to be outside in the silence than to get anywhere. On one of those walks, she looked up at the stars, clear and piercing against the winter sky, and whispered, "I used to believe she was somewhere up there, watching, waiting. I don't know if I believe that anymore, but I talked to her anyway." I nodded. "Maybe that's enough. Be talking is the point." She smiled faintly. "Do you ever talk to anyone who's gone?" I thought of my grandfather, then the man who'd taught me how to change a tire and fix a broken hinge, the one who used to tell me stories while we worked side by side in his old garage. "Sometimes," I said, "when I'm fixing something that reminds me of him, or when I don't know what to do." She squeezed my arm. Funny how much of the past still lives with us, even in the quietest ways. The night before the memorial, she laid out her clothes on the bed, a dark gray dress she hadn't worn in years, a string of pearls that had belonged to her mother, and a pair of low black heels that she examined with a look of wary amusement. "It's been a long time since I wore these," she said, holding them up. "They'll probably hurt within 5 minutes. I'll bring a backup pair of flats in the car," I joked. "Emergency rescue kit." She smiled, but her hands were fidgeting again. I walked over and took them gently in mine. "You're going to be incredible," I said. "You're going to make people feel. That's all anyone really wants, to feel less alone." That night, she didn't sleep much. I knew because I didn't either. She stayed curled beside me in bed, and though her body was still, her mind was wide awake. I could feel the weight of her thoughts pressing between us like a pulse. Just before dawn, she whispered, "What if no one remembers her?" "They will," I said softly. "Because you do. And when you speak her name, when you share her story, you're keeping her alive in ways that matter." The next morning, the drive to the school was silent, both of us wrapped in our own thoughts. The auditorium was already filling when we arrived, the soft hum of conversations echoing off the high ceilings. A photo of Julia sat on an easel near the stage, one I hadn't seen before. She looked radiant, laughing. A moment of joy frozen in time. Lenora stared at it for a long time before making her way to the front row. When her name was called, she walked slowly to the podium. The silence in the room deepened as she unfolded her pages. And then she began. Her voice was clear but quiet, the kind that made people lean in. She didn't speak of tragedy, not really. She spoke of love. Of mornings spent laughing over burnt pancakes, of long talks on the back porch, of her daughter's stubbornness and brilliance and wild empathy. She painted Julia in such vivid strokes that by the end, even those who had never known her felt like they had. When her voice broke, just once, she paused, took a breath, and kept going. It was raw, it was real, it was beautiful. When she returned to her seat, she didn't look at me at first. She stared straight ahead, tears on her cheeks, hands shaking in her lap. I reached over and slid my fingers into hers, and finally she turned. The look she gave me then worn, hollow, grateful, was one I'd never forget. "I did it," she whispered. "You did more than that," I said. "You gave her back to the world." On the ride home, she fell asleep against the passenger window, her breath fogging the glass. I drove slowly, not just for the snow, but for the weight of what had just passed. I glanced over at her, this woman who had spent so long locked inside, her own grief, and marveled again at her strength, not because she didn't break, but because she allowed herself to feel every crack, every fracture, and still chose to speak that night. Didn't say much. We curled up on the couch with the fire burning low and let the quiet say what words couldn't. In the hush between us, I felt something new, something like peace. It's not the absence of pain, but the presence of something stronger. Resilience, grace, love. Not as a burst, but as a steady flame. And I knew, as sure as I knew anything, that staying had been the most important decision of my life. The days after the memorial passed like mist, slow, drifting, heavy with something unspoken. Lenora carried herself differently, not with more weight, but with more presence. It was as if speaking Julia's name aloud in front of others had finally let her daughter breathe in the world again, no longer confined to old photos and whispered memories. She moved through the house in softer steps, but not with grief dragging behind her. It was something else, a kind of release. There was still sorrow in her eyes, of course, but it was no longer consuming. It had settled into something gentler, like the afterglow of a long-held storm that had finally broken. We began rearranging some things in the house, not out of boredom, but as an act of renewal. She asked me to help her move an old chest from the attic that had belonged to her grandmother. Inside were letters, photographs, hand-stitched linens, a few trinkets from another lifetime. We sat on the floor for hours going through it all. Lenora told me stories about a childhood summer spent on her grandmother's farm, about riding bikes without brakes and sneaking peaches from the neighbor's tree. She laughed with a kind of abandon I hadn't seen before, letting the joy of those distant days bubble to the surface without guilt. Eventually, she paused, holding a small envelope with a broken wax seal. "This was the first letter I wrote to Julia when she went off to college," she said. "I never mailed it. I was afraid it would make her homesick." She opened it carefully, eyes scanning the handwriting that was once hers, but felt like a stranger's now. Told her all the things I never said in person, how proud I was, how scared I was for her, how much I missed her already. Funny, isn't it? Sometimes we save the best parts of ourselves for paper. We decided to create a memory wall in the hallway. Extravagant, just a collection of framed photos and mementos that told the story of her life and Julia's. Moments frozen in time like soft reminders that they had been here, that they had loved, that they had mattered. It wasn't a shrine. It was a celebration. And every time we passed it, I saw the way her fingers would brush the frame at the center, Julia in her cap and gown, sunlight catching in her curls around that. Time Lenora received an email from one of the women who had attended her reading at the memorial. It was a heartfelt message, full of gratitude, and at the end, a simple question. Would she consider leading a grief writing group at the community center? Just once a month? Lenora read the email aloud to me that night, and then stared at the screen in silence for a long time. "What do you think?" I asked. She looked at me, her expression unreadable. "I think I want to, but I'm scared all over again. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I can't carry their stories on top of my own? I leaned forward and placed my hand over hers. Then don't carry them. Just hold space for them. Let them carry each other. That's all anyone really needs. So she said yes. And at the first session, 5 women showed up. Each with different stories, different wounds, but the same ache beneath their words. Lenora didn't try to fix them. She just listened, offered prompts, encouraged them to write even if it hurt, especially if it hurt. She told them that writing didn't need to be polished or poetic, it just needed to be honest. After that first meeting, she came home lighter. They didn't want answers, she told me. They just wanted not to feel crazy for missing someone. They wanted someone to say, yes, me too. That phrase stuck with me. Yes, me too. So simple, so human. And I began to realize that this was what Lenora had done for me all along, without even trying. In her presence, I had found a place to say, yes, me too. I had lost things, grown numb, forgotten how to soften, and with her, I was slowly becoming a man I recognized again. One evening, spring began to whisper at the edges of the cold. I found Lenora out in the garden, brushing away dead leaves and clearing space for new growth. Too early to plant, she said, not looking up. But it feels good to make room. I knelt beside her and started pulling weeds. Kind of like life, huh? Sometimes you clear things out before you even know what you're making space for. Glanced over, smiling. Exactly. That night, we talked about planting a new garden. Not just reviving the old beds, but starting something from scratch. Maybe some raised planters, she mused. Something easier on the knees. And I want to grow tomatoes. Real ones that taste like summer. So we made plans. We measured the space, drew sketches on napkins, argued over whether basil should go next to the tomatoes. It wasn't about vegetables, not really. It was about tending something together. It's about looking forward. It's about believing in the future. We started walking farther through town into the nearby trails, past the park where couples strolled and kids played. Sometimes we'd stop and sit on a bench, not saying much, just watching life go by. And I realized that I no longer felt like a visitor in her world. I was part of it, fully, quietly, deeply. One night, as we lay in bed with the windows open, just a crack to let in the breeze, Lenora whispered, "Do you think we're strange?" I turned my head. Why? Because we found each other so late. Because we're not married or defined by anything but our choice to stay. I smiled. I think we're rare. I think that's beautiful. She reached for my hand under the covers. I've never felt so seen. Neither had I not in the ways that mattered. By the time March rolled around, the snow had given way 2 long, wet afternoons that smelled faintly of earth and promise. The world outside was shedding its stillness, beginning again with small, deliberate steps, just as we had. Birds returned tentatively at first, then louder, bolder, echoing their calls through the thinning trees, as if reminding everyone that silence had its season, but sound would return. I often found Lenora on the porch in the mornings with her. Coffee, watching them flit from branch to branch, a quiet smile on her lips that hadn't been there a few months ago. It wasn't just that she looked lighter. She was lighter, not in body but in spirit, in how she carried herself, how she allowed the day to greet her without flinching. One morning I came outside and found her sketching. It's just rough outlines in an old notebook, raised beds, stone, paths, trellises. A garden drawn with the same thoughtfulness she brought to her writing, except now it was living color she was planning for. "I want to use reclaimed wood," she said without looking up. "Something with a history. It makes the vegetables taste better, I think." I smiled, easing into the chair beside her. "You planning on writing poetry about your tomatoes?" She gave me a look over the rim of her mug. "If they're good enough, I might." The lightness between us had become second nature, this ebb and flow of teasing and tenderness, of leaning into each other without needing to hold on too tightly. There was trust now, built not on promises or declarations, but on showing up again and again in the small ways that mattered. Like when I came home after a long afternoon helping a neighbor fix their busted sink and found a bowl of lentil soup waiting, still warm, with a slice of buttered sourdough on the side. The way she left notes in the laundry basket things. Like, "Thank you for folding these with love," or "Your socks are braver than most." We laughed more often, but the quiet moments were where we lived. It was in those spaces, in the tending of houseplants, the peeling of apples, the rearranging of books, that our connection rooted itself deeper. We weren't rushing toward anything. We were just being. And for two people who had once believed they'd already lived their best years, that kind of presence felt like a miracle. Then came the email. Lenora received it late one afternoon while we were sitting on the porch, splitting a basket of blueberries. She didn't react right away, just stared at her phone for a while, her thumb hovering over the screen. "It's from an old colleague of mine," she said finally. "From the, magazine." I sat up a little straighter. "What do they want?" "They're putting together a special issue," she said, scrolling. "Essays from contributors who've stepped away, pieces about second chances, reimagining purpose. They want me to submit something." She laughed, but it was thin. "Funny, isn't it? Spent all those years trying to get away from that life, and now it's knocking." I could see the conflict in her eyes, Zeke's excitement braided with doubt. A door opening that she wasn't sure she was ready to walk through. "You don't have to decide right now," I said gently. "But I think it's a good sign. A sign that your voice still echoes." That night, she sat at the kitchen table long after I'd gone to bed. When I woke around 2, I found her still there, pen in hand, page half filled. "Did I wake you?" "No," I said, sitting across from her. "I just missed you beside me." She reached for my hand across the table. "I think I'm going to do it. I think I want to write again, not just for myself or for the women at the center, but for whoever needs to read it. For whoever needs to hear that starting over at 50 doesn't make you a failure. It makes you brave." In the days that followed, she began her piece. I didn't ask to read it, and she didn't offer. But I watched her settle into herself as she wrote, more focused, more vibrant, like a part of her that had gone dormant was stirring awake. Meanwhile, I kept myself busy fixing a squeaky screen door, clearing the shed, helping the neighbor kid build a birdhouse. I had learned not to hover. Support didn't always mean stepping in. Sometimes it just meant being nearby. The day she submitted the essay, we went out for pie. She wore a red scarf I hadn't seen before, her hair pulled back in a way that made her look younger, freer. "I feel like I just mailed a piece of myself to the world," she said, as we waited for our order. Naked, vulnerable, like I left the front door open and walked away. I reached across the table and touched her wrist. That's what courage looks like. The pie came blueberry, her favorite tanned. We sat there, savoring each bite like a reward. She kept checking her phone every few minutes, not expecting a reply yet, but hoping all the same. When I teased her about it, she rolled her eyes and said, "You try mailing your soul off and not refreshing your inbox every 30 seconds. The next morning, the reply came. She was in the garden, raking dead leaves, when she got the email. I heard her call my name sharp, urgent, not frightened but charged. I ran out, and she was standing there with her phone in hand, eyes wide. "They loved it," she whispered. "We're publishing it. In the April issue." I pulled her into a hug, lifting her slightly off the ground, spinning her once. She laughed, breathless, tears bright in her eyes. "You did it," I said. "You brought something back to life." "They said it might even be the cover story," she added, burying her face in my shoulder. "Can you believe that?" Yes. Yes, I could. Because I had watched her transform not into someone new, but into the version of herself that had always been waiting to return. The woman who loved fiercely, who wrote honestly, who wasn't afraid of tenderness or truth. That night, we danced in the living room. No music, just movement. I pulled her close, and we swayed slowly, barefoot on the wood floor, the fire casting long shadows on the walls. "Tell me this isn't strange," she whispered against my neck. "It's not strange," I said. "It's exactly right." And it was. The April issue hit the stands on the first Monday of the month, a quiet morning cloaked in mist. The day began like any other coffee brewing, the faint hiss of the kettle, the rustle of newspaper as I flipped through it out of habit. But there was an undercurrent of anticipation humming beneath everything. At! Lenora didn't say much. She never did when she was nervous, but she stood at the window longer than usual. Arms folded, watching the driveway like she was expecting something to arrive. And in a way, she was. A part of herself returned to her in ink and print. The package came around 10 a.m. a brown, padded envelope with her name printed in clean block letters. She held it for a second, just stood there in the doorway turning it over in her hands, as if weighing not the magazine but the meaning of it all. Then she looked up at me, her expression open, vulnerable, a mixture of disbelief and pride. "Do you want to see it with me?" she asked. "Of course," I said, stepping closer. We sat on the couch, knees touching, and she carefully peeled the seal open. Inside were 2 pristine copies of the magazine, the April cover showing a minimalist design with soft hues and her title, her name, right underneath. Her breath caught. "There it is," she whispered. I didn't think seeing it would matter this much. "It matters," I said, tracing the edge of the page. "It matters because you dared to speak again." She opened to the article, flipping slowly until her words stared back at her in crisp font. She began reading aloud softly at first. Then, with more steadiness, her voice growing stronger with each paragraph. The essay was about grief, yes, but also about rebuilding, about discovering new kinds of courage in unexpected chapters of life. She wrote about losing Julia, about the loneliness that settled in like dust, and about the stranger at the door one winter day who brought not just medicine, but company, conversation, and eventually something far deeper. She didn't name me, not exactly, but I was there between every line. I was the warmth in her metaphors, the reason she could use the word healing without sarcasm or bitterness. When she finished, she looked up at me with tears on her cheeks. "Do you see what you did?" she asked. "You gave me my words." "Back. No," I said, brushing a tear from her jawline. "You chose to find them again. I just held the light." That afternoon, the phone started ringing. Old colleagues, distant friends, people who had drifted away over the years but found their way back through her voice on the page. She took the calls, all of them gracefully and without apology. I watched her become something I hadn't realized. She still had in her confident, radiant, utterly present. She stood a little taller, smiled a little freer, and when the last call ended, she turned to me and said, "I want more of this." "Then let's make room for more," I said. And we did. She started writing again, not just essays, but fragments, reflections, even poetry. She began waking up early to write by hand, with pen and paper, before the rest of the house stirred. She said the words came clearer before the sun fully rose, when her dreams were still close enough to borrow from. Some mornings I'd find her already dressed, sitting on the porch with a notebook and coffee, hair tangled from sleep, eyes sparkling. "I'm chasing a sentence," she'd say. "It's being coy this morning. We built the garden next, the one we had dreamed about all winter. Raised beds with reclaimed wood, a small stone path winding between them, trellises for beans and sugar snap peas." She chose the seeds carefully, speaking to each packet as if it contained a small miracle. "Tomatoes, but only the heirloom kind," she insisted. "And lavender. We need lavender." I dug the trenches and hammered the frames while she arranged. Everything with precision, like setting the stage for something sacred. When we planted the first row together, her hands in the soil beside mine, she looked up and said, "Do you ever feel like we've been given something we didn't even know how to ask for?" "All the time," I said. We held a small gathering in late spring, a casual afternoon tea, with a few of her writing group members, some neighbors, and an old friend from the magazine. Lenora wore a sundress and her hair loose, and she moved through the garden like it was an extension of her body, pointing out tiny green sprouts, explaining where the basil would go. They spoke of writing, of grief, of rebirth, and I kept to the edge mostly, letting her take up space, her voice confident and full. It was the first time I saw her lead a group without hesitation, and it struck me this was her now, not a ghost of who she had been, but a woman fully in bloom. That night, as we lay side by side, she said, "You know, I thought the most important part of my life was over when Julia died, but it wasn't. It just... paused. And your kindness, your patience, you pressed play again. You pressed it yourself, I reminded her. I was just here when the music started back up. She smiled, tucked her head into the crook of my shoulder. Either way, thank you. We didn't talk about what we weren't in titles. There was no need for declarations or labels. Ours was a kind of quiet, evolved love. Not a whirlwind romance, not a desperate need to prove anything. It was gentle, steady, built from coffee cups, shared chores, and the kind of intimacy that grows not from passion alone, but from consistent presence. I loved her in the way you love a sunrise without fanfare, but with reverence. Sometimes I'd catch her watching me when I worked outside, her face soft, unreadable. "What?" I'd ask. She'd just shake her head. "Nothing. Lad, you stayed." And I always would. By the time the summer sun began to stretch its long golden fingers across every corner of the backyard, the garden had grown into something worthy of its own story. Lenora walked among the tomato plants like a proud curator, gently turning leaves over with her fingers, inspecting blossoms with the same attentiveness she used to revise her drafts. The basil was thriving, the lavender fragrant even from the kitchen door, and the trellises we had doubted would hold up now bore thick clusters of sweet peas, curling upward like hope in green form. Life was blooming in every direction around, us and between us, and yet there was a part of me that knew, however quietly, that nothing ever stayed this soft forever. One morning, she surprised me with a picnic basket. "Don't ask questions," she said, pressing a kiss to my jaw as she handed me a thermos and a worn-out blanket. "Just follow me." We drove out past the edge of town, windows down, the wind warm and scented with wildflowers and cut grass. She directed me toward a winding dirt road I'd never noticed before, then down a trail that led to a small, hidden lake tucked beneath a canopy of pines. "Julia and I came here once," she said as she spread the blanket under a large oak. "We made daisy chains and skipped stones." I remember thinking even then that one day I'd come back here with someone and let the silence speak. We didn't talk much as we ate hard-boiled eggs, sliced cheese, fresh bread she'd baked. That morning, the lake shimmered in the noon light, broken only by the occasional leap of a frog or the ripple of wind. It was the kind of silence that didn't ask to be filled. After we finished eating, she lay back, her head resting on my chest, and we watched the clouds move, slowly and with purpose. "Do you think love has an expiration date?" she asked, after a long while, her voice so soft I barely caught it. I thought for a moment. I think the wrong kind does. It's the kind we try to force. The kind that demands more than it gives. But this, I tightened my arm around her shoulders. "This doesn't feel like it has an ending." She smiled faintly. "I used to think real love belonged only to the young. But by the time I figured out what it meant, the doors had closed." She traced invisible circles on my forearm. "But now, I think we just weren't ready then. Maybe love finds you when you're finally quiet enough to listen." Later that evening, as we packed up and walked back to the car, she paused halfway up the hill and turned to me. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing the parts of me that I kept buried so long. I forgot they were there." "You unearthed them yourself," I replied. "I was just the one holding the flashlight." In the weeks that followed, life settled back into rhythm, but the air between us had subtly changed. There was a deeper awareness now, a knowing that came from shared vulnerability and mutual trust. We no longer danced around each other with caution. We moved with the quiet certainty of people who had chosen to stay not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Lenora's second essay was published in early July. It was more personal than the first, more raw. It spoke of surrender, how she'd let go of the version of herself that had been built around grief and instead stepped into something softer, braver. She didn't hide her age or her fears. She wrote openly about the loneliness that used to ache like a second skin, and how one winter day, a man with kind eyes and a quiet presence knocked on her door and changed her story without ever asking her to. She closed the piece with a sentence that stayed with me for days: healing, I've learned, doesn't arrive like a thunderstorm. It's the warmth of a steady hand held over time. That article sparked more emails, more speaking invitations. One woman even sent her a handwritten letter, thanking her for writing the kind of truth I didn't know I was allowed to speak. Lenora cried when she read it, not from sadness, but from the relief of connection. "I'm not invisible anymore," she said. "I thought I was, but I'm not." Her confidence bloomed like the flowers lining the back fence. She began teaching weekly at the center, small workshops on expressive journaling, grief recovery through writing, even a class on memoir building for beginners. She came home tired but invigorated. Her eyes alight with stories of the women she met, widows, divorcees, caregivers, all of them carving meaning out of their pain. "They don't want perfection," she told me one night. "They want permission, and I finally feel like I can give it." We fell into a new kind of closeness. I'd make her tea while she wrote. She'd leave notes in my tool bag before I left for odd jobs. Sometimes we spent hours without speaking, just existing in the same space, the kind of silence that hums with belonging. One Saturday afternoon, I came home from town to find her sitting cross-legged in the middle of the living room, surrounded by photo albums and old letters. "I'm thinking of starting a book," she said. "Something about starting over at 50. Or maybe love stories that don't follow the usual rules." "Whatever you write," I said, kissing the top of her head. "I'll be your first reader." That night, as we lay in bed, she whispered, "I think I love you in ways I don't have words for." "You don't need words," I said, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "I feel it every day." I did. Our love didn't burn fast or wild. It grew the way gardens grow, with attention, intention, and the quiet belief that something beautiful is always possible, no matter how late in the season you plant. We were proof of that by August. The weight of summer had settled into everything: the soil, the walls, the folds of our clothes. It was the kind of heat that slowed things down, made the hours stretch long and syrupy. Even the birds seemed to take their time between songs. Our routine adapted accordingly. Mornings were sacred, crisp and quiet, spent tending to the garden, or sipping iced coffee on the porch before the sun crested too high. Afternoons called for fans, cold fruit, the occasional nap. Evenings, those that was when things came alive again. When the house exhaled and the sky turned gold and pink and every shadow softened like the hush of a bedtime story, it was in one of those evenings, the storm teasing the horizon, that Lenora turned to me while we were shelling peas on the back step and said, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd met earlier?" I thought about that for a moment, the rhythm of my hands continuing without pause. "I used to," I admitted. "When I first started falling for you, I'd imagine a version of us 20 years ago. Maybe we'd have a kid by now, a different kind of life, and now," she asked. "Now I think we met exactly when we were supposed to," I said. "We had to become who we are now to even recognize each other." She nodded slowly, smiling at the bowl between us. I liked that, like we were both walking our own winding paths and finally crossed at the clearing. A breeze rolled through, warm and slow, carrying with it the scent of lavender and impending rain. We didn't speak for a while. We didn't need to. This was the way we existed best now, in the quiet spaces. The in-between moments where love didn't need grand declarations. It just was. The next day, Lenora got a phone call that shifted something. It was from her sister, Elaine, who lived 3 states over, and whom Lenora hadn't seen in almost 6 years. They'd spoken infrequently since Julia's death, an emotional chasm neither of them quite knew how to cross. But this time, Elaine's voice on the other end of the line was soft and open. It's the kind that makes you stop what you're doing and just listen. "She wants to come visit," Lenora told me after. The call, her voice tinged with disbelief, said she's been reading my essays, that they made her feel like maybe she didn't know the whole story. I could see the swirl of emotion behind her eyes. Hope, fear, uncertainty. "How do you feel about that?" I asked gently. She looked out the window for a long time before answering, terrified. "But maybe it's time." Elaine arrived the following Friday with a modest suitcase and a bouquet of wildflowers from a roadside stand. The reunion was hesitant at first, like 2 strangers trying on old shoes to see if they still fit, but there was laughter to hesitant, then fool around by dinner. It was as if a dam had cracked just enough to let something real through. I watched them talk long into the night, heads close, voices low. There were pauses where one or the other would look away, collecting their breath or swallowing a lump. But there was also warmth, tears that weren't heavy with sorrow, and eventually a kind of fragile peace that had clearly been waiting a long time. The next morning, Lenora sat beside me on the porch, her sister still sleeping inside. She said she blamed me, she admitted, for leaving, for not letting her in when things got dark. And I told her I blamed her too for not pushing harder. For pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. Did it help? I asked. I think it did, she said. We were both grieving and didn't know how to grieve together. Maybe we can learn now. That weekend changed something. In Lenoran, just with her sister, but with herself. She seemed lighter again, but this time not because she was burying anything. Rather, it was because she'd finally begun the slow work of forgiveness. Not just for Elaine, it's for herself. To it around that time, we hosted a small dinner party, just a few friends, a couple of neighbors, some women from her writing group. Lenora made lemon rosemary chicken, and I baked a cherry pie from scratch with a crust that nearly broke my spirit. There was music, soft jazz crackling through the old speakers, and laughter that filled every room like a warm draft. At one point, I stepped outside to grab more chairs and caught a glimpse of her through the window, standing at the sink, talking animatedly, hands moving like punctuation. Her eyes were bright, her cheeks flushed. Something about the way she tilted her head when she laughed made my heart swell in my chest in a way. I hadn't expected it hit me then how fully we'd built a life, not just out of shared space and chores and jokes, but out of restoration. How what began with a knock on her door and a paper bag of prescription medicine had become a chapter neither of us saw coming. That night, after everyone had left and the dishes were stacked and the music silenced, I found her sitting barefoot. In the garden under the moonlight, her skirt tucked beneath her knees, the lavender swaying gently in the breeze. I sat beside her, handed her the last glass of wine, and asked, "What are you thinking about?" She looked up at the stars for a long time before speaking. "I think this is the first time in years I've felt like I'm not waiting for the other shoe to drop. Feels good, doesn't it?" I said. "It does," she replied, resting her head on my shoulder. "You healed something in me, not all at once, not with magic, but with your presence, with your steadiness. I don't know how to explain it, but I feel whole again." In that moment, I knew that no matter where life led us through more seasons, through aging bodies and shifting realities, we would move together, not in a perfect line, but in harmony. Two souls who had found a second beginning long after the world had told them those chapters had closed. She kissed me then soft, certain, and slow. And in that kiss was every word she hadn't written yet, every poem, every essay, every unwritten chapter of the life we had unexpectedly built together. Autumn crept in slowly, as if asking permission to replace the warmth that had settled so comfortably in our bones all summer. The garden began its gentle decline vines, yellowing, flowers closing tighter each day, the air cooler each morning. But instead of sadness, there was a sense of rightness in the change. Everything had its season. We'd had ours in full bloom, and now came the time for slowing down, for gathering what had grown and preparing for what might come next. Lenora adjusted with grace. She swapped her sundresses for cardigans, her early writing hours for afternoons. By the fireplace, often curled up with her laptop or scribbling in one of her worn leather journals, the words still came, sometimes even more freely than before. She told me once that love had made her fearless, not the kind of reckless courage of youth, but the grounded kind. The sort that whispers, "You're safe now. You've been seen and still accepted." We spent our days in quiet companionship. Mornings were often filled with ritual, coffee brewing, her humming in the kitchen, me chopping wood or checking the tool shed. Evenings were slower now, board games, reading aloud, falling asleep on the couch with her feet tucked under my leg. We'd become something of a local story, too. The folks at the general store asked about us often. and her essays continued to circulate in small publications and online forums where people left comments that read more like confessions than reviews. One message stood out. A man in his 60s wrote, "Your words saved my marriage." I was angry for a long time, thinking it was too late to fix what we had. But your story reminded me that there's always a door, even if it's quiet, even if it creaks. Lenora printed it and taped it above her desk. There came a moment, quiet but weighty, when we sat on the porch one dusky afternoon, and she reached into her cardigan pocket, pulling out a small envelope. "I've been thinking about something," she said, "and I want you to know it's not about formality. It's about choosing, about naming what we already are." Inside the envelope was a ring, not new, not flashy, just simple gold, with the tiniest inscription on the inner edge. "Stay." "I don't need a wedding," she said quickly. "Not even a party. I just want you to know that I choose you, today, tomorrow, however many days we have." I swallowed. "Hard. Then let me say it back to you," I told her. I pulled my own ring off the old silver band I'd worn since my 20s and handed it to her. "I want you to keep this, just until I get you one of your own, and then we'll match." Sweet. Didn't make announcements. No grand ceremony. Just us and 2 rings. And the knowledge that what we'd found was rare, not because of its drama or passion, but because of its peace. The first snow came early that year, frosting the edges of the world outside while inside the fireplace burned slow and low. Lenora's health held steady, though she moved a little slower, winced sometimes when she bent too quickly. But her laughter remained loud, her gaze sharp, her appetite for life unyielding. I'd catch her staring out the window at the garden, buried in white, and I could almost see her sketching stories in her mind. That winter, we began working on a joint project to book about grief and second chances. My part was more practical, scanning her handwritten essays, editing the layouts, occasionally contributing a chapter from my point of view. "People need both perspectives," she told me. "They need to see how healing isn't a one-person journey. It's 2 people walking beside each other, even when they don't know where they're headed." The project gave us purpose during the long, cold months. It also brought us closer than I thought possible. Revisiting the early days, her silence, my hesitation. The medicine bag that changed everything, it made us grateful all over again. Sometimes we'd cry while rereading certain passages. Other times we'd laugh, hard, especially at the details. We'd forgotten how I once spilled tea all over her manuscript, how she once threw a shoe at a raccoon thinking it was a burglar. Our story wasn't a fairy tale. It was real, messy, beautiful. Earned by spring, the book was finished. We titled it "Stay: How Love Found Us in the Quiet." The publisher agreed to a small release, mostly online, but the response was warmer than expected. Readers wrote in with stories of their own daughter reconnecting with her estranged mother, a widower finding companionship again through a shared garden plot. We read every message together, sometimes aloud, sometimes in silence, but always with awe. Our little life, tucked away from the world, had somehow become a beacon for others. One evening, not long after the book's release, we sat in the garden newly, planted again, the soil still rich from last season's efforts, and I turned to her. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" "All the time," she said, taking my hand. From medicine deliveries to shared manuscripts, from grief to growth, and all because you knocked on my door." "I didn't just bring medicine," I said. "I brought a heart looking for something too. I just didn't know it at the time." She leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "You stayed. That's what healed me." The sky darkened slowly, the stars beginning to blink awake one by one. We stayed out there until the chill crept into our sleeves, not saying much, just breathing together. 2 people who had been broken in different ways and somehow, by fate or chance or quiet persistence, become whole in each other's company. It wasn't a dramatic ending. There were no violins, no sweeping finales, just life. Days that followed days. Coffee in the morning, writing in the afternoon, her voice reading drafts, my hands in the dirt. The slow, beautiful echo of 2 lives intertwining, not with fireworks, but with the soft rhythm of stay, stay, stay. Up next, You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.